All right, good morning, everyone. My name is David Schmidt. I'm with Mississippi Power Company. Really the MC and get to kick off and do maybe some housekeeping items before the experts take over on the IRP and really give an update of our 2023 midpoint, which leads into our 2024 IRP process. First thing, this is our second public workshop. First one we had was 3 years ago. At that time, we hadn't had a recent filed IRP, so it was really, I would say, long on process, short on a lot of numbers. And so we got a lot of good feedback, and then when we did our technical workshop with a lot more details and numbers, we got a lot more collaboration and feedback. So this time, we've changed things up a little bit. We filed our 23 IRP, which is our midpoint update. Along with that, we filed pretty much very similar work papers. So those were filed 6 weeks ago, so there's an extensive amount of information out there for all the parties prior to this meeting. This presentation will follow along with a lot of those assumptions that were laid out in those work papers. But we can't do the same thing every time. So our first meeting was in person. Second meeting was purely virtual. This time we're back to in person, but we can't leave things alone, so we made another change. So now we have a method for folks that are not here that have a question to submit a question. So I will spell this out. It's not overly intuitive. I'll give you that on the front end. And these are all caps. G2 MPC IRP PW at southernco.com. And as I understand the process that we're going to, this is kind of a new trial, it's another iteration. They'll be submitted, but in order to help with the flow and the folks here that are asking questions, the questions that are submitted will be read at the end. So lastly, we covered kind of where we came from, where we are today. Lastly, just maybe an acknowledgement about how valuable this process is for us as well in terms of the collaboration with folks. I know after our 2021 IRP and after our initial public workshop, we got a lot of feedback in terms of the transparency, and of that transparency, I believe our IRP was filed publicly, and 13 or 15 of the 18 attachments were all public as well. And then going back to the point about collaboration, there's a lot of firsts that we had, and a lot of these were suggestions made by various advocates. One, we introduced solar and battery as generic resources that could be picked within the model. We also allowed the model to pick energy resources, i.e. solar, prior to having any kind of capacity need. So if there's an energy benefit to adding it earlier than you had a need, the model would do so. There was requests for scenarios that had several different things: a higher DSM adoption, as well as higher distributed energy resources. Those were incorporated into our 21 IRP as well. We also noted at the 21 IRP that there's some things that were brought up by advocates that were worth further study. And you'll hear some of that today, of some things that were incorporated. There's a request for additional technologies to be included in the future, and you'll see some of that today. Suggestion that we reinstate our industrial energy efficiency component of our program. You'll hear about that today as well as the addition of a DSM potential study and some potential for additional low-income programs, and all those will be addressed today as a follow-up to those items that we noted for future consideration. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Randy Hubbard that's going to start our discussion about our coordinated planning. Sorry, I left off a slide here. I've really talked about this, at least in general. There were 5 different things that we consider substantial adjustments from the 21 IRP. when I say substantial, they're just different than what we had before. They weren't different enough to make us really change course on our action plan from the 21 IRP. And we will go over these today. Of course, the Inflation Reduction Act, I think everybody in this room is probably aware of at least some of those impacts. There was a request from Bates White that we do a retirement optimization, so we'll talk about that. As we get more penetration of renewable across our system, the cost to maintain reliability associated with those intermittent resources are becoming a little more of a concern, and we've actually done some modeling of that. New load forecast that we'll talk about some changes in our future, as well as some addition of pre-commercial technologies. So in the past, everything was commercial, very proven. Now we're taking a look at what are the technologies that are being developed today that could be developed in 10 or 15 years from now, and incorporating those into the modeling and see how it acts. So with that, I will turn it back over. Thank you, Randy.
Let me do a technology check here. Can everybody hear me? Is the mic picking up my voice? Thank you. So my name is Randy Hubbard. I work in resource planning at Southern Company Services, and we support Mississippi Power Company and their sister retail operating companies with the development of their integrated resource plans. So we're going to continue the discussion here, and really before we get into the detail assumptions that go into the makeup of an integrated resource plan, show some high level, still sticking to the process information again. And if you were here in 2021 at the technical conference the last time, some of this is not going to be new to you. It's more of a refresher. But wanted to just quickly talk about the coordinated planning process. So Mississippi Power Company and their sister retail operating companies engage in and participate in a coordinated planning process whereby while each company is obligated to bring the adequate amount of resources to serve their customers reliably and cost effectively, the three retail operating companies actually aggregate their plans together and benefit from load diversity, pooling, and reserve sharing. So, for example, load diversity, they don't all peak at the same time, so they actually get to plan to a reserve margin that's slightly lower than the system reserve margin that accounts for that load diversity. Then on the reserve sharing piece, it's a benefit or an option for each of the companies to temporarily rely on any surplus that the other operating companies may have. So that's another benefit of the coordinated planning process. So while things are aggregated together, each company, so Mississippi and their sister companies, still make the final resource decisions for their company and their plans, but they get to do that with being informed by the benefits of the aggregated plan. And one of the key things, that helps coordinate and facilitate that process is the fact that they really communicate and coordinate very closely with the other operating companies and know what the decisions are being made, to know, what benefits can be gained via that process. So that's the coordinated planning process. The next thing I wanted to share, we did not show this the last time, but it was in the IRP document itself. And I'll say up front, it's quite the eye test. So if you can see this, you may not need your annual eye exam this year. So keep that in mind. I don't know if we have a certificate we can give you to take to your doctor or whatever. But really want to just take a few minutes before we get into the details to show a high-level overview of a couple of things. So this flow chart is broken into different sections. The top section really is a very high-level overview of the generic expansion planning process. That includes a lot of the inputs that go into that process. The middle part are things that are common, the generation technologies that we'll talk more about today, the fuel forecasts and other forecasts that are kind of common, generic across all resource decisions. And then the bottom part is where it shows the other factors or additional factors that get taken into account when there's time to make a specific resource decision, not that's informed by the generic expansion plan, but may differ from the generic expansion plan. So that's kind of the high level. There are a few things I wanted to point out. So when we talk about a needs assessment, and Theron will cover this later, there's some key information that we need to be able to identify when there's a capacity need, how much that capacity need is, and then third is what's the optimal mix of capacity and energy resources to meet the customer's needs. So one is we really need to know what's going to happen to our existing fleet over the planning horizon. Then another is we need to know what our customers' peak demands and energies are going to be through time. So we have a load forecast. Then there's other key inputs like our demand side programs, any kind of renewable options that are inputs into that planning process. But once we have all that information and we know what our future needs are, that's where we use the mix analysis or the optimization analysis to identify a generic expansion plan for each of the scenarios, given the input assumptions that we have. And so that generic expansion plan, so now we have an evolution of the fleet that is meeting our capacity and energy needs for all years of the planning horizon. Then a data point from that is then we can go to a more detailed production cost process where we can get out of that the expected marginal cost, or sometimes referred to as our avoided energy costs, for every hour of every year of a 20, 30 year plus planning horizon. Then that data point is used to inform other resource decisions. It could be used in an asset evaluation, or sometimes referred to as the unit retirement studies. We also use it to evaluate any demand side opportunities, future or incremental demand side opportunities, and we use it to evaluate any potential renewable opportunities that then become inputs into the planning process, and then we optimize the generic plan around that as part of the iterative cycle. So that's high level there. All right, so the second part is that's a generic expansion plan. It does provide us a kind of a window into what an optimal mix of resources may look like given the set of assumptions that we're using. The next part is if there is a need to make a specific resource decision. So if Mississippi Power Company, for instance, has a capacity need in a time frame for where we need to start taking action and developing a plan to meet that need, that's where we move down to the specific generation selection process. And if it's a self-build, we'll factor in site-specific information, whether it's a combined cycle, CT, or whatever, battery, wind, solar, whatever technology is being considered. We'll factor in transmission impacts. We'll factor in, if it's a gas resource, we'll factor in pipeline infrastructure or fuel transportation impacts, things of that nature. And in addition, historically, we've done requests for proposals and see what the market offers. So that could be one of the levers we pull as well to see what the market offers when we have a specific need. And then we'll make the best decision for Mississippi's customers in that specific case. So, and one of the things about that may differ from what the generic expansion plan said, because those site-specific impacts could result in a different answer than what the generic plan said. But just wanted to kind of show you a high-level overview of the generic process, and then what happens when actually there's a near-term need and we make a specific resource decision. Any questions before we move on to the...
I've got a question. So,
hold on one second. I think we need to get a mic.
That's all right.
And I didn't realize I had the mic.
So I know Southern Company, I believe y'all still have a net zero 2050 pledge. Where in all of these boxes does working on integrating the net zero pledge into this process come in? Did y'all get that?
Okay. And we'll talk more about that later as we go through the scenario planning process. But I can hit something just very high level. So this process is done for all of the scenarios that are part of our scenario design. That look at a range of fuel prices, look at a range of carbon prices, and look at another component that you'll hear about is where we plan to a certain CO2 emissions reduction annually all the way to 2050 and beyond. So this process is done for all the scenarios that we look at as part of our scenario design, some of which do achieve the net zero goal for the company. that answer your question?
Probably have to see it applied.
Okay. Stay tuned. We'll show the scenario design and talk more about that, and you'll actually see some of our carbon assumptions that are part of our scenario design. Any other questions? Okay. So next up is Philip.
So I'm going to talk about our existing retirements. I'm sorry. I'm going to talk about our existing generating fleet right now, just a little bit. We have, as you can see, we have plants throughout South Mississippi. We have 7 CTs. We have 1 at Plant Sweat, 1 at Plant Watson, and 5 at our Chevron Codren facility that we have at the Chevron refinery in Pascagoula. We have 4 gas steam units we either own or co-own. 2 at Watson, 2 at Greene County. We have 2 coal units that we co-own, and we have 3 combined cycles. 2 combined cycles at Plant Daniel, 1 combined cycle at Ratcliffe. In addition, we also have 4 solar PPAs that total 157 megawatts of solar nameplate capacity. So, I mean, that's our current generating fleet as is right now. Oops, sorry. And in terms of our generating capacity mix and our energy mix, we are about 14% coal. That represents the 502 megawatts at Plant Daniel. And we are 84% gas, which represents the CTs and the gas steam units and the combined cycles. But in terms of energy mix, we still produce a lot of energy from our combined cycles and our gas steam units. And so that's why you see upwards of 91% of our energy mix being gas-powered instead of necessarily coal-powered. And again, with our different technologies, our different generating technologies, you can see that previously we've still been very heavy in our CCs. Upwards of 60 to 70% of our generation is coming from our CCs. But even projected into the future to 2030, we're expecting 80% coming from our CCs. So we're still very heavily relying on our combined cycle generation. And you can see as units phase out and our load sort of drops, we still get a lot of generation from CTs and other, which represents our solar PPAs. And so in the 2021 IRP, we laid out a plan to retire Watson 4, Greene County 1, Greene County 2, and Daniel, our portion of the Daniel coal units. And for the 2023 IRP we're going over now, and for the 2024 IRP we're going to file. We're going to continue with our plan to retire these units as we outlined in the 2021 IRP. Does anybody have any questions about our current existing resources? All right, that's great. It's easy. And then I'll hand it over to Mike to talk about our energy efficiency in Rule 29.
Thanks, Darren. Good morning. I am Mike Pruitt, and I work with our energy efficiency team. And where is the? Thank you. You know, everyone knows in 2014, Mississippi Power Company was part of. Wow. Am I going way ahead? We'll start again. In 2014, Mississippi Power Company introduced Quick Start. But I'll tell you that in 2014, that was not Mississippi Power's first foray into energy efficiency. I've been with the company a long time, and I'll tell you that the preponderance of my job since I was hired has been energy efficiency in some form, working with our customers. So today, our portfolio has that and very much more. Rule 29, this is kind of the guidance that we have been given, and we try to adhere to this, but our energy efficiency plan draws on considerable experience in this arena, and it considers the factors that are explicitly stated in Rule 29. That's quantifiable and achievable savings, customer reliability benefits, cost effectiveness, rate impacts, and customer interest and participation potential. Within our portfolio that we have put together, we monitor and report using industry standard screening tests, and I'll list them real quick: total resource cost, utility cost, ratepayer impact measure, and participant cost. And we report those cost effectiveness measures with all that we do. This is a very important guideline for everything we do within our portfolio. Well-defined DSM offerings provide opportunities for customers of all types to adopt energy efficiency as a way to control their energy expenses and to make themselves more productive. And we commissioned Brightline Group. Some of you may know of Brightline Group. They have done M&V for us historically. It's a group. It's a female-owned entity that is based in Boulder, Colorado. They have a presence in Mississippi. And we retained them to create a specific MPC service territory study to help inform what we're doing today and what we need to plan for in the future. Multiple impacts have come from the market study already, and those include the aforementioned inclusion of our large commercial and industrial segment into our portfolio, and some opportunities to expand our low-income residential program. We call that program Select, and what we've done now is we have added some measures within the low-income program to serve multifamily and to serve English as a second language communities, which is something we had not been doing. These are things that we have learned from the market potential study. The study has also validated a very important step that we've taken is part of overall, is it has helped us to define our targets moving forward. So the first time ever, Mississippi Power Company in 2021 has put together a 7-year look ahead and says, what do we need to do to accomplish these goals, and what goals do we want? And we established a 7-year, it's intended to have an ultimate savings of 0.5 of 1%. Half of 1% of our total retail sales will be accounted for by savings that we provide or incent to our customers. The market potential study validated our 2028 target by identifying a potential of 0.6% by 2031. And so we're at 0.5% by 2028. We think we are right on target with that. And what happens at the end of this 7-year period, we'll continue the planning process as we move. The target was derived by evaluating our current portfolio performance, by our market saturation within our service territory, keeping in mind we have 190,000 customers and about 150,000 residential customers, and then peer utility benchmarking, very important. So the next step we took was to identify what we thought to be the budget. This budget is a projection. While I will say that the prior slide and the graphic up here is a target that we intend to accomplish, we hope that this is the budget that we need to accomplish that target. Any questions? Am I going too fast? All right. Noting again, our targets are intended to abide by and balance the components within Rule 29, which are quantifiable savings, cost effectiveness, and rate impacts to all of our customers. This is an important step that we've taken in our DSM portfolio. Now here's a look at year-end 2022, and I'm not going to get into the detail of this slide. This is something that we publish and report as part of our annual reporting. We do have the May report coming that we have almost ready for submission now, and we actually like that because the May gives us a 12-month. We operate on a 12-month calendar, and the EDP filing is kind of an awkward time frame for us, so it's easy for us to do the May annual filing. This will be in there, and this is meant only to depict a couple of things. Number one, The first number of lines up there, maybe 10 lines, are our residential programs. There's a couple of large commercial programs depicted here in these line items. We have an outdoor lighting program. And if you'll take a look at the megawatt hour savings, little over 29,000 megawatt hour savings, and the budget, you might look at our projection for the year and realize that we have exceeded both in both categories. So we don't stop when we get where we're going. This is in our report, and that we do calculate, I wanted to add this, we calculate that about 42% of our overall budget is spent on low-income residential programs. And we think that's important in our state. And moving forward, we're confident that our portfolio balances the principles outlined in Rule 29 and will require continued innovation to achieve our targets. We continually look at new technologies and emerging markets, and we are ready to serve those markets. And there's a couple of examples on the slide. And with that, I think that's all I have for DSM, unless someone has any questions. Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Brandon Looney. I work for Southern Company Services Resource Planning with a few of the other folks here this morning. And thank you. I have a responsibility for resilience and reliability, and want to speak today on a couple of reliability topics that have been updated or enhanced since the last IRP. So we'll talk about the reserve margin, and then we're going to talk about effective load carrying capability, and then renewable integration. And so we'll hit those topics in order here. We perform a reserve margin study every 3 years, and it's a system-wide study, so it encompasses Mississippi Power, Alabama Power, and Georgia Power. And the purpose of the study is to determine a target reserve margin for each of the operating companies that feeds into, as Randy mentioned, the overall IRP plan and determines how much capacity our utilities need to carry in order to serve our load reliably and cost-effectively. And the reason we do that is to handle uncertainties in our industry and in the load that we serve. Those uncertainties include weather. Probably the largest uncertainty is how weather impacts load, and everybody's experienced that through both extreme cold events and extreme hot events. And we have the good fortune here in the South to experience both of those at different times. Also, economic growth or economic uncertainty drives load, so there's always error in our load forecast, and we want to account for that, particularly in the shorter term where load can outpace our projections in a way that's hard for new resources to come online, and so we need to carry a little bit of reserves to handle that kind of activity. Unit performance is accounted for. Power plants, like most mechanical systems, are not perfect. And so we have to account for the performance of our generating fleet. And then the market purchase availability. We do account for market purchases and being able to get energy from both neighboring utilities and independent power producers, but there's uncertainty in that as well. And so those are the major uncertainties that we want to account for in the reserve margin study. When we set the target reserve margin for the system, we really are looking at two main drivers. The first is a cost optimization. So we're not just concerned with being so reliable at any cost. We're really looking at where's the optimization for our customers on balancing cost and reliability. And so we would all like for the power to never go out, but at what price do you get that reliability? And so we're trying to balance that, and that'll make a little more sense when we see the results of the most recent study. But just so you know, we are running a cost optimization for our target reserve margin, but we do look at a minimum reliability threshold. So while cost is very important, also keeping the lights on is very important. And so there's an industry standard or common practice of looking at what's called a loss of load expectation. How often should you expect the utility to have a disruption? And there's a metric out there of 0.1, which means one disruption every 10 years on average. And so we do look at that metric, and we want to make sure that the reliability that we're achieving through our cost optimization at a minimum achieves that level of reliability. Historically, our cost optimization has provided a level of reliability that exceeds that. And so our customers have benefited from both an optimized cost standpoint, but also enhanced reliability above what some would consider to be an industry standard or common practice. The reserve margin study that we conduct, like I said, we do it every 3 years, and it's a very involved study, a very comprehensive study, very robust study. And this slide just gives a sample of the inputs into our analysis. So this is not a spreadsheet exercise. It's not a simple comparison of resources and load. It's a fully integrated production cost simulation. And so we account for all the things that are shown on sort of the rainbow here, everything from, as we mentioned, how our units perform from forced outages, how our units perform when it gets extremely cold, fuel constraints that we have on the system, such as natural gas tightening when it's cold, and the local gas distribution companies, their demand is increased, so we compete with gas for heating load. The amount of operating reserves that we carry, our demand response activities, so we directly model active DRs in our simulations. And I mentioned load forecast errors, both short-term and long-term, how our units operate across different temperature ranges. So we have generating facilities that when it gets cold, they actually produce more power than when it's warm, and that's a benefit. So we take account for that. Scarcity pricing, or how the market price is impacted by regional demand. And so you can buy energy on the market at one price when it's 75 degrees outside, and at a different price when it's 99 degrees outside. So we account for that. That builds into market restrictions as well, which also accounts for transmission interface capability. And then the CT price is our proxy for how much it costs to buy capacity or to build new capacity. The value of lost load is how much it harms our customers when energy supply is disrupted. And then lastly, what is the demand load shape that we're trying to serve? There's a question right here.
Appreciate it. Thank you. I'm Simon Mahan with the Southern Renewable Energy Association. Will you all be able to provide us with the reserve margin study and the inputs as data so we can take a look at them, so we can provide feedback on it?
We did provide, I think, the reserve margin study report in the IRP midpoint update.
Okay.
It's pretty conclusive, a pretty expansive report. It doesn't have every single data file, but I think it should satisfy your curiosity on the overall study.
Okay, yeah, well, and so two of them that are of particular interest to me, the value of lost load. What number do you all use for that?
We generate an internal value of lost load number through some customer surveys that are done periodically, and then some sort of broad economic adjustments to those. I don't remember the number right off the top of my head. We also run a sensitivity using the ICE calculator. That's a more industry publicly available method of calculating value of lost load. So it is a customer class weighted value that we use.
Okay, and then on the forced outage and the cold weather outages, is this for the 2021 reserve margin study?
Yeah, what's feeding the 24 Mississippi IRP is the 21 reserve margin study. We will repeat the reserve margin study in 24, but it'll be done in a time manner that doesn't support the 24 IRP, so it's on a little bit of a different time scale. So those are the values that were in the 21 study.
Do you happen, and so the 21 doesn't capture the Winter Storm Elliott outages?
It does not. We are actively looking at how did the performance in Winter Storm Elliott compare to what's been modeled. and, enhancing and updating our data set. I'll say that our experience in Winter Storm Elliott was largely consistent with our 21 data set. I mean, it gives us new data, which is valuable, but I would not anticipate any significant changes, more just, minor adjustments to our cold weather outage curve.
And so, do you happen to know if these data include Winter Storm Uri? Because I think that happened in 21.
I believe our 21, anything that was in the 2021 reserve margin study would have been 2020 and before. So to the extent that Winter Storm Uri affected our units, which I don't recall big impacts for that storm, I don't think they would have been included in that data set.
Okay. And then on the operating reserves, I think that's where I've got a question here. Are you, with reserve margin study, are you just looking at the Mississippi Power reserve margins, or are you also looking at the reserve margins for the pool?
Yeah, the study is a system study. So we're aggregating all the loads, and then we operate as a pool. So we're carrying operating reserves, both spin and non-spin contingency at the system level. And so we don't allocate those down to the OPCO level for the reserve margin study. We establish a system reserve margin study, which then flows down to the operating companies, and then there's a diversity benefit. And I think that value is shown in a slide, an additional slide.
Okay, great, thank you.
Real quickly, just to speak further to the robustness of the study, it is a production cost simulation. It has some probabilistic characteristics, and this just speaks to what we look at. We look at 58 historic weather years, or that's what we looked at in 2021. So the actual weather over the last 58 years. We create two load shapes off each of the 58 weather years. One that assumes the year starts on a Tuesday and one that assumes the year starts on a Saturday. That assures that the peak day happens on a weekday in at least one of those two weather patterns, such that we don't mask high load with weekend or holidays. And then we apply 5 different load forecast errors to each load shape. We run each load shape through 100 different iterations, which have different forced outage draws and other things. And then we studied 13 different reserve margins. So just to make us sound really impressive, we include, that's over 750,000 simulations that go into the reserve margin analysis for each study. Real quickly, what oh yeah.
One question.
Sure.
On that last one, I was just curious that you look at the past 58 weather years, right? So going back to what?
Yeah, the early 60s.
65 or something. Are you waiting at all for changes in conditions, like what we've seen in the last 20 years?
Yeah, currently we are not. We do not probabilistically weight. We weight each weather year equally. The question you ask is a question we ask ourselves, and often. And to date, we haven't seen really a definitive need to weight that. We have extreme weather in the 60s from a cold side that then didn't occur again until the mid-80s, and then didn't occur again until 2014. And so there's no clear pattern. The obvious sort of question is, what about warming trends? And that's on our mind. But again, if you look at the 58-year data set, the warm weather comes and goes as well. So currently, we think that any weather that has occurred in the last 58 years could easily occur again. And one of the things that we're considering, it won't be in the 24 IRP, but we are considering shortening that from 58 to, say, just a rolling 50. So you would always be dropping the oldest weather years and adding the newest. That's another way to sort of balance the question you raised. But the current approach is to equally weight the weather year data that we have available. certainly open to thoughts as y'all are involved in this process on how we would do that going forward. The way this process runs is we model the system, our system, at a reduced reserve margin level. So we'll actually remove generating facilities from our system until we get down to a starting point, maybe 18% reserves in the winter, something like that. And then we'll incrementally add generating units that represent about 1% of the load at a time. So you can look at 18%, 19%, 20%, so on. And then for each one of those increments, we compute total cost to operate the system. We also compute the reliability costs at each one of those incrementals, and then the cost of the incremental capacity. And it draws this optimization curve. And then we do a value at risk assessment on the back end of that. And we'll illustrate this process when you see the next slide, which is really a summary of the results of the 21 reserve margin study. So this curve you see is, I mentioned, every 1% of reserves was modeled, and then we iterated between those 1% to get 0.25% values. And then you see this balance as you increase reserves, costs come down for some period of time, and then at some point they turn and go back up. So the components in the cost are production costs, which are the blue. That's how much it costs to operate the system. A lot of that is fuel cost. And then the red in the middle is the reliability cost. And so that is that value of lost load. There's a few other minor components in reliability cost, like emergency purchases, emergency demand response. But the majority of the reliability cost is the value of lost load. And then what I think is green at the top, I'm colorblind, so I apologize for that, is the capacity cost. As you see, in the starting point, there's zero cost there, and then as you move to the right, you're adding the cost to build that incremental capacity. So what we see here in our results is the economic optimal reserve margin is the bare minimum point on that curve, and that appears at 24.25%, 24.25% reserves. And then we see what's that LOLE of 0.1 threshold that was down at the 20%. And then this gray VAR range. One feature that you might notice is at the EORM, or the bottom point of the curve's kind of flat. So for very little incremental cost, you can actually mitigate your risk. And that's what that VAR, value at risk determination, looks at, is what's the incremental benefit to spending a little bit more. And so it's worth it to move to the right on the flat part of the curve because you're spending very little to mitigate additional risk. And so when we look at that, we look at that all the way to the 85th percentile on the risk point, which could take you to 29.5%. But then we do a little bit of a judgment, and in this case, we said we don't think the benefit to going to 29.5% is there, and so we set the target at 26%, which is within that VAR range. And kind of visually, and it's not a visual exercise, there's numbers behind it, but kind of visually you can see that 26% occurs about where that curve starts to kind of change shape. And so that visually tells you, what's happening is we're trying to take advantage of the flattest part of that cost optimization curve. The target reserve margins that were set coming out of the 21 study are shown here and compared to 28, and they happen to be the same as the 28 numbers. So for the winter, we set a 26% reserve margin in 2018, and we chose to keep that same level in 2021. Now, you might say, so are you telling me every result of the study was the exact same? No, but the results showed that 26% is still a robust number for planning. So there's a lot of benefit and some stability in that number, and the results confirm, the 2021 results confirm that that's still a great number to serve our customers. And so we chose to keep that. You do see the Mississippi Power number. As I think Randy mentioned, there's some load diversity benefits in our pooling arrangement. Part of that is each operating company can bring a value slightly less than 26%, but then when you apply that to the coincident peak, you get 26%. So Mississippi Power's reserve margin for 2021 is 25.15% when you account for that load diversity. The summer values here, we set a summer value of 16.25% back in 2018. We're keeping that. Our focus on the reserve margin study was largely winter. That's our highest risk period currently, and also what binds sort of our resource needs is the winter piece. But we're not ignoring the summer. At this point, it's just a less binding constraint for us. All right, that concludes the reserve margin piece. Unless there are any questions, we'll move on to capacity equivalence. And here's where we want to introduce the effective load carrying capability, or ELCC, and how we've adopted that in Southern, which is new to our planning process since the 2022 Mississippi IRP. So when we're talking about capacity equivalence, we're talking about how do we recognize the capacity contribution of resources that might be non-dispatchable or energy limited. And traditionally in our IRP, for fully dispatchable traditional resources, we just recognize their nameplate capacity. So if you've got a 500 megawatt combined cycle, it gets 500 megawatts in our IRP. But for units that aren't dispatchable, they might be like a renewable resource, or they might be energy limited like storage. We have traditionally followed what we call an ICE factor determination, or incremental capacity equivalence, where we went through an analysis that compared that resource to a dispatchable resource. Often a simple cycle combustion turbine was used as the proxy. And so what all these words describe is that process that we would look at what's the reliability enhancement that a CT could provide to the system compared to the reliability enhancement that a test unit or a test resource would provide. And the generic CT was used, and we use the SERVA model for our reliability assessment. It's the model that was used for the reserve margin study. And for the ICE factor, we used expected unserved energy as the value, the metric that we were comparing. And this was somewhat of a unique process that we used. It's actually very comprehensive, but also time-consuming and resource-consuming. And so we've actually moved to this effective load carrying capability, or ELCC process. The benefits are it's much more commonly used in the industry, so we feel that it moves us onto sort of a common platform as we compare our resource decisions to others. It's something that I think our advocate community is more familiar with. It's actually computationally a little more simplistic, so there's some benefits for that. And we still think it does a great job of assigning a capacity value to resources like renewables, like storage, like demand response. So real quickly, for those that aren't familiar, all this process does, and instead of comparing a test resource to a CT, this just says how much additional load can the system carry if I add a test resource or add a new resource. So that's what load carrying capability. We still use the SERVA model. We still use all those historic weather patterns, so it's still a very comprehensive evaluation. It does compare the LOLE metric instead of the EUE metric. So the metric's a little different, but it's still a common, well-established reliability metric. If we look at how has ICE versus ELCC impacted Mississippi Power's resources, we determine capacity equivalents for their existing solar resources that feed the IRP, And if you see a comparison here between the ICE factors and the ELCC factors, we actually see an increase in the capacity values for these solar resources using the ELCC method as opposed to the ICE method. So it's actually a capacity enhancement for Mississippi Power, where we're actually gaining more credit out of our existing renewable resources by this method. And you might ask, well, why is that? And I think there's a number of reasons, but the one I would highlight is when we calculated the ICE factors in the past, we relied on a single sort of generic production profile out of renewable resources, kind of a typical production profile. In the ELCC method, within the model, every weather year has its own weather-correlated production profile for the renewable resource. And so there's things that happen, like when it gets hot, it's normally sunny. And so the solar resource actually, has this correlation. And even in the winter, a lot of times, seeing when the sun comes up, and in Mississippi, the sun comes up at certain times versus Georgia. So you get all of those kind of moving parts in these weather-correlated profiles, and we just see a little bit of an enhancement in that. So that's where we are with the ELCCs. Yeah, go ahead. Question.
Thank you. Yeah, Simon Mahan with Southern Renewable Energy Association. Yeah, I think this is a big improvement for y'all, and using ELCC is the right way to go. Can you explain how the ELCC values that you're going to use are used in the integrated resource planning process? And then more specifically with new generation units, can you tell us a little bit more about the ELCC values that you're using for new solar resources and new wind resources?
Sure. It's a pretty broad question, so I'll try to attack it one piece at a time. For the existing resources, these simply feed the resource ledger and determine how much capacity does the company have to meet its capacity obligation, including load and reserves. So that part's pretty straightforward. How values are used for additional resources or new resources, there's a few pieces to that. We calculate incremental ELCC values for all kinds of different resources: solar, wind, battery storage, different kinds of demand response. And those feed the cost optimization model and can also feed things like RFP evaluations. And so what we do see in our solar fleet, while these resources, say for the winter, we're 10 to 20%. We do see a continual decline in solar capacity value, such that our incremental winter resources are now between 5 and 10%. And in the summer, I think it's somewhere in the 25 to 35%. And so that kind of feeds the solar piece. The wind piece, we don't have a lot of wind in our system. Our generic wind ELCC value is about 50%. We're working on enhancing our wind data set because our existing wind comes from off-system, and that's not for Mississippi Power, but other southern entities. We're really looking at, well, what about southeast wind? If we could build high tower wind in the southeast, what would the ELCC values be for that? And then, let that be an IRP selection. So wind is an evolving piece for us. And then battery storage, we're seeing really robust ELCC values for generic batteries, 90% plus, even at rather short durations, 2 to 4 hours. And keep in mind, with any energy limited resource, the more of it you add, the capacity value declines. And so we try to account for that as well. But all of those values feed the IRP. Randy might mention it later. The solar resources, while they do have a 5 to 10% winter capacity value, they're being modeled as energy only. And that's a modeling feature that I'll let him defend later if you have some questions about that. But when we make actual resource decisions, we do account for that. And then when the resources are added, we would assign them the appropriate capacity value in the ledger. So we're not missing that value. It's just sort of a model simplicity for a resource that 95% of its value is energy.
So back to the wind, did you say 50% of ELCC or a 15?
50, yeah.
And that's from the wind out in Oklahoma and Kansas and
Mhm.
up there? Okay. And so.
And again, that, we don't have much wind, so the wind
Right.
that we do have is kind of getting the tier 1 value.
Yep, that's right. Yep, that makes sense. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right, the last thing I want to hit is a renewable integration study, which might be an interesting topic. This is a study that we've conducted since the 2022 Mississippi IRP. And we think it provides a lot of insight into how we continue to add to our overall renewable portfolio in the Southeast, where, as a lot of you know, solar is our most readily available renewable resource. So while we call it the Renewable Integration Study, at this point, it's really the Solar Integration Study. We worked with Astrape Consulting to do this study. So they actually did the analysis for us. They have done similar analysis for a handful of other utilities. And so we wanted to leverage their experience and also try to build a study that was consistent with some activities in the industry. The objective of the study is to look at how do renewable resources, solar resources, challenge system operations, and then what's the cost to mitigate those challenges. So there's both the impact and the cost to mitigate built into the analysis. And again, the SERVA model was used here. The biggest difference is when we run the reserve margin study or when we do ELCC values, SERVA is run on an hourly basis. And so you're just looking at how does the system respond from 1 hour to the next. When we ran the renewable integration study, the model is run on a 5-minute basis. And so the model has to respond to load changes and resource changes every 5 minutes. And that gives more insight into the impacts you see with intermittent resources like solar, where what's happening minute to minute is actually a lot more important than an hourly average value. The flow chart kind of describes what we did. We had a base case where we moved all the solar from the system, and that established sort of our baseline reliability metric. And then we would add a tranche of solar, and you would see an impact to our ability to balance load and generation every 5 minutes. That's the goal here, to keep load and generation perfectly balanced every 5 minutes. And so we would see an impact of that when you added solar, and then we would mitigate that impact by increasing load following reserves. Think about that as spinning reserves. And then you would see what was the cost to mitigate that. And then you would repeat the whole process by adding some more solar so that we could look at the impact of various solar penetration levels. This is the layout of the solar penetrations that we looked at. So we started again with a base case that had no solar, and we added in 3,000 megawatts as our starting point, which is kind of where our system was at when we conducted the study. We had about 3,000 megawatts of online solar. And then we went to 5,000, which was at the time about how much solar was committed, not yet online, but committed to in the system. And then we just incrementally increased 8, 10, 12, 15, and 20,000 megawatts. Again, this is at the total southern system. So think about total southern load in the 38,000 megawatt range and these amounts of solar. So we thought we were casting a pretty long line, looking at up to 20,000 megawatts of solar. And then we ran two additional sensitivities where, in addition to just adding solar, we also added battery storage to the system to look at, well, what if we increase the flexibility on the system by adding battery storage? And then instead of batteries, we looked at RICE engines, so another flexible resource that's not storage, but a dispatchable flexible resource. This is the results of that study. And again, I think we included the report in the IRP update, so there's a lot more information available. But just broadly, the results, you see the red line, which is called base case, is really the add only add solar case. And so what we saw is a cost, a mitigation cost of adding solar or an integration cost of around $3 a megawatt hour. And that cost and thus the sort of reliability impacts were very stable on the system from the starting point of the study to about 12,000 megawatts of solar. And so that first 12,000 megawatts of solar there's not zero cost to integrate it, but it's a stable cost, and it's something that relatively speaking is pretty modest. And then what we see is when you get to 12,000, there's a tipping point on our system, and to mitigate that solar becomes much more challenging and thus much more expensive. Now, what we also saw is if you increase the flexibility of the system by adding battery storage or a RICE engine, we'll focus a little bit on batteries here just for a second. Two things happen. First, you drive the integration cost down, and you keep a stable operating position all the way through the study regime. And so, you know, what we take from this is a couple things. It does give us some proxy cost values for thinking about resource additions, but it also gives us a value proposition for adding something like battery storage to enable the further advancement of clean renewable energy on the system. So we're working on how do we implement all of these learnings into our IRP process. But we think the insights here are very valuable, particularly if you think the future is well out there to the right on this graph. I always say let's make sure we get off the red line and get on the green line. And so part of our IRP objectives will be to sort of drive those types of outcomes, given what we've learned from our integration study.
If anybody has any questions, please let us know. And I'm going to run and keep the microphone so that people online can hear your question. I put a break slide in here, but let's hear any questions about the renewable integration study first, or comments.
Yeah, this is Simon Mahan with the Southern Renewable Energy Association. I haven't dug into the solar integration study in total yet, and I appreciate y'all providing that with the midpoint update. But without having read the whole thing, this is pretty impressive. The fact that y'all are using the effective load carrying capacity, you're integrating the batteries, you're looking at the RICE units as an alternative. I mean, I think this is, without saying, one of the more robust evaluations that you all have ever done. And so just wanted to give you all some accolades for that. So thank you.
I don't think I mentioned it, but I will say our current plan is to update this study every 3 years, sort of as we update the reserve margin. They're not necessarily the same study, but as we kind of update the database that feeds these studies, we'll redo them both to make sure we're capturing how the impacts of this evolves as our system transitions as well. So there should be an update to this in another year or two. And we're working to replicate this with wind resources, consistent with how I spoke about the LCC with wind. So those won't be part of the 2024 Mississippi IRP, but they're, next time we're here 3 years from now, maybe we'll have those features as well. All right, thank you guys.
All right, I was mentioning that I did put a break slide in here. It may be too early to have a break. We'll just keep going. What do you think, Ben? Let's just keep going. Okay, our next section is scenario development, and Charles Rossman's going to talk about that.
Great, thanks, Theron. Thanks, everybody. Good morning, Charles Rossman. I'm also with Southern Company Services Resource Planning Group and support Mississippi Power in these analyses and other. And what I'm here to talk with you a bit about is another key, all right, very well, thank you. Another key feature of things that go into developing the integrated resource plan, and that is the scenarios that we use, that is there's a full set of other assumptions about things during a long-term plan that are uncertain. And what we do is to design a set of scenarios, that is a set of packages of assumptions about how the world may unfold, in which we're building the integrated resource plan, and that set of scenarios is a foundation for doing these analyses for the IRP as well as many others. So I'm going to talk for the next few minutes about the development of our scenarios. That for the next few minutes, a bit about the scenario development process. We develop, supporting the midpoint update, a set of 6 different scenarios, and they vary in 4 different areas. One has to do with greenhouse gas pressure. A second has to do with technology cost and performance. A third has to do with load growth, and a fourth has to do with future fuel prices. Each of these 4 areas is, of course, uncertain, and so what we try to do is to identify a few different views of how things could unfold in these areas, and then assemble them into a set of, in this case, 6 scenarios. In different years, we have different numbers of scenarios, and it sort of depends on what seems important, what seems uncertain, and how things get put together. For the midpoint update, the number of scenarios was 6. So each of these areas I'm going to talk a little bit about. And actually, there's a little bit of tag teaming here. Randy will come up and talk about technology, cost, and performance. I'll talk about that process and how we put those things together. And I'll talk about the others. So that's the plan for the next few minutes. Any questions before we get going on that? Okay, great. So the first thing I'll talk about is a little bit about the process. Many of the things that are important can be interconnected, and the way that we try to get many of them connected is looking toward a very robust, integrated resource, very integrated planning model of the U.S. energy economy. And so the one, especially for fuel prices, but in a few other areas, we look toward the National Energy Modeling System that is used by the Energy Information Administration in creating their annual energy outlook. And so this is a very robust model of the way the U.S. energy economy evolves, and we look to it for guidance in some ways. And so that up here, so the left side, is that there is an overall energy economy view of how these things fit together. Key inputs from that, as well as other key inputs that I'll talk about, then move to the right-hand side of this slide, and we then do internally various analyses composing our scenarios that in some ways are similar to the ones that EIA uses, and in some ways are different. And that from this, we then develop several scenarios. So just want to identify that there's sort of two things going on, and we do these analyses, mainly the ones that I'm going to talk about are an internal process. Many years ago, we did work with an external consultant on this, and if you've been paying attention for a while, you may be remembering that. We no longer have this done externally and are doing many of the analyses internally now, as well as then using the EIA's results. All right, so I'll talk a little bit about natural gas. Natural gas and other fuel prices are a key input to the integrated resource plan. And for natural gas, we adopt 3 different views of how natural gas prices may evolve: a lower view, lower price view, a moderate price view, and a higher price view. For the past few years and for the midpoint update and for and likely for the 24 IRP, we will adopt 3 different scenarios, 3 different views that the U.S. Energy Information Administration has created for the annual energy outlook. And so for our moderate view, we adopt the reference case that the EIA has developed. For our higher price view, their scenario that we adopt is the lower natural gas and oil supply case. And for our lower price view, it's the higher natural gas and oil supply case. There are some data here about what key numbers are there. Again, we sort of look to be sure that it all makes sense and fits together and pay attention to what changes year to year. It doesn't change a lot. The EIA does adopt, like us, they do some studies annually and many things periodically, and so periodically some things can get updated here, but things don't tend to change in this area a whole lot. Data here that you can see in the slides for a few numbers there. And then the next slide is our illustration of our natural gas price forecast that we use across the scenarios. The reason to have spent the time now talking about EIA is that that's sort of the bulk of it. That's the sort of green panel in the middle. But this illustration also acknowledges that we have a short-term, a separate short-term view of natural gas prices. That's the tan slice there in the middle. And the EIA's forecast in their scenarios only goes out to 2050, and for many analyses, not all, but for some, we need and use prices that go on beyond that, and so we extrapolate. This is an illustration of, we focus on EIA, but there are a few other components to it too. The short-term thing is we use NYMEX futures contract, closing prices of NYMEX futures contracts for natural gas delivery over the next few years, and adopt those as our natural gas price forecasts, and then interpolate that into the long-term thing that we adopt from EIA, and then extrapolate. Questions, and the historical stuff is on here too as interest. There's always differences in natural gas price. Questions about this or how we do it? Okay, great. Next thing to talk about is greenhouse gas pressure. Greenhouse gas pressure is, of course, a really important feature of how an electricity system gets adopted, gets built, and we take a few different views about how this might evolve. And in particular, we take four different views about how it might evolve, and this slide has a little bit of information on each of those. The lower degree of pressure, $0 view, is one in which there is not an explicit price on greenhouse gas pressure, explicit price on greenhouse gas emissions. There is a little bit of pressure, though, coming from the existing Clean Air Act and the way that we envision it unfolding and the requirements that it may impose under the existing Clean Air Act. In particular, at some point in the future, the Clean Air Act, as it evolves, as is currently written, will require, or is very likely to require, greenhouse gas abatement on new emitting facilities at some point. And so we don't know exactly when that'll happen, but under the Clean Air Act, it would be expected to. And so there's a particular year at which carbon capture is required on new units, for example, and there are a few other things too. The $20 view is a moderate view of greenhouse gas pressure. It involves having a CO2 price, envisioning a price beginning on CO2 emissions in a particular year and growing from there. When we have price pressure on greenhouse gas emissions, we don't necessarily, it doesn't necessarily mean that we believe there will be a price on CO2 emissions, but that this is a proxy for a moderate degree of pressure that may come in various forms. So that there may well be an explicit price, there may not, but a degree of pressure that is moderate in that way. And so it's a price at $20 per metric ton of CO2 starting in 2025 and rising at 5% above inflation. Our higher degree of greenhouse gas pressure is a higher starting price and a higher rate of increase beyond inflation. And then the fourth view of the way greenhouse gas pressure could evolve over the planning horizon is one in which there is an explicit ton limit on the emissions that the fleet would be allowed to emit. And I'll have an illustration of it in a minute, but it's an explicit limit on tons emitted that falls over time in a particular pattern. So anyway, these are our four views of how greenhouse gas pressure may evolve on the fleet, and we assemble these into scenarios that the table of scenarios will come in a couple of slides, so we'll see how it gets. But these are the four views we adopt. Again, we don't know how greenhouse gas pressure will evolve, but it is uncertain, it is important, and we consider different ways in which it could evolve, and these are those four. Questions on this before I move on?
So back on, one slide back. I broke it, I'm sorry. So are you all, for these futures, just looking at Mississippi Power, or are you also looking at the Southern Pool?
Yeah, so the way that, I probably should have been clear at the beginning, the scenarios that we develop are fleet-wide, for the system. And then the IRP analysis, how the fleet evolves analysis, is done at a fleet level. Mississippi Power's portion of that is a component, but this is all for fleet, and we don't differentiate among the operating companies or other or portions of the fleet.
And so in the model, you're effectively having to change Alabama Power and Georgia Power alongside with Mississippi Power to get kind of like a pool dispatch.
Correct. In each of the scenarios that may have a different view of greenhouse gas pressure, the way that the fleet evolves under that degree of greenhouse pressure is the entire entity, the whole fleet.
And I think we're going to get here later, but your CO2 intensity target, that's kind of Southern's carbon emission goal.
So, not necessarily. Both the higher degree of greenhouse gas pressure view and the $50 view and the emissions limit view that support among the scenarios that support the midpoint update, these two are most consistent with achieving the net zero goal. And so they aren't necessarily and even the CO2 intensity target is not the Southern Company goal necessarily. It's mainly inspired by existing regulations existing congressional proposals that have become focused more on things that would act like a ton limit. And so that's its inspiration, is putting a limit on and versus having a price are meaningfully different ways of applying greenhouse gas pressure, and the intensity target is designed to represent that kind of pressure as has appeared in several pieces of proposed legislation.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Well, on these simple cycles, you've got the 25% annual capacity factor and the 10% capacity factor switched down in 2025. How does that work in the model? Are you, I presume you're allowing the CTs to dispatch to 100% on an hourly basis, and then how do you ensure that they remain below these levels on an annual basis?
So that is a limit that can be put into the model. Putting constraints into the model can make it more difficult to solve, and so our actual first approach is to leave the limit off and see if CTs actually would surpass, would bump up against such a limit. And if they do, then we'll resolve with the limit in place. But so it's intended to be not an hourly capacity limit, but an annual one.
And so yeah, I think I understand. Yeah, that's great. Okay, thanks.
Welcome. Other questions? Okay. Okay, so this is an illustration then of those four views of the way in which we envision greenhouse gas pressure might evolve. On the left scale is the price, and on the right, and that's for the 0, the 20, and the $50 per ton CO2 views. That's on the left scale. On the right scale is the one to use looking at the emissions limit. It's stated here in percent of current emissions. So again, on the right scale, the top is 100%, and then the purple line then falls in a particular pattern and gets down to 10% by 2050. So that's how to read this, an illustration of the things I talked about earlier. Any questions about this? Okay, great. Randy?
So we're going to take a few minutes now to talk about, have to get it adjusted to me there. The generation technologies and the process we go through to screen those technologies and ultimately get down to the list of ones that are included in the expansion planning process. We're also going to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, and we're also going to show some of our solar cost assumptions that we've included in this midpoint update. So this is a busy slide again, but one of the key things to keep in mind is Brandon did a really good job of sharing just how computationally complex the reserve margin study is. Well, likewise, the generation expansion plan and production cost modeling process is also very complex and computationally very time consuming. So ideally, we would love just to give the model every existing technology and emerging technology that's out there, but that would not be very reasonable from a runtime standpoint. So one of the processes that we use, and this is a very common industry practice, is to start with a very expansive list of generation technologies, both ones that are commercially available today and also ones that are emerging and we think will become commercially available in the future. And then go through a process of screening those, looking at numerous factors to get down to a list that's much more manageable for the expansion planning process and ultimately the production cost process. So that's really what this slide shows is as you work your way from left to right, we go through a pretty detailed screening process, and it gets more detailed as you work your way to the right, which is ultimately the final list that goes into the Aurora expansion planning process and Aurora production cost process. And we'll show more technologies in a moment, actually here. One of the things we wanted to talk about is one of the changes that we incorporated for this midpoint update and will likely carry forward. And it's actually in part due to feedback from this group here, the stakeholders in this process, is to look at more technologies. So one of the changes that we made was historically we had really focused more on commercially available technologies for purpose of expansion planning. But we're continuing to do that, and those are the ones that are familiar to everyone. Natural gas combined cycles, CTs, solar, battery, and wind. And I will say, real quick on the wind, that is now included, and that is also in part due to some feedback from this group that we got in the 2021 IRP process. So wind is now included as a selectable technology as well. So those are our commercially available technologies, and on the pre-commercial side, the new ones that we began to add are combustion turbines with SCR. So combustion turbines are available, but these are the advanced frame, and they do include the SCR. There's some activity taking place in the industry on those, so we think they will be commercially available in the near term. Okay, let's get right at it. Then also natural gas combined cycles with carbon capture and sequestration. And then some other technologies that are maybe less common are supercritical CO2 combined cycle, also with carbon capture and sequestration. So So that combined cycle is actually a combined cycle that has a zero carbon footprint technology. The medium duration energy storage, and that's actually a category. It can be, something in the 8-hour range, storage range. It could be a battery. It could be compressed air energy storage, or other storage technologies that kind of fit in that 8-hour-ish range. And then advanced nuclear. So we looked at both small modular reactor nuclear technologies and the Generation 4. For purposes of modeling, we used the small modular reactor and let that kind of be representative of the advanced nuclear class. So we have included those technologies in this midpoint update and will likely continue to do so. So you can see things have evolved from where we were to 3 years ago to where we are now. I do want to point out, though, that with the pre-commercial technologies, we do have to acknowledge that there's technology risk, there's cost risk, and there's performance risk. So the way that we account for those risks are delaying when some of these technologies can be selected by the model. So you'll see on the screen, so for medium duration storage, we don't allow that to be selected to 2033. And then for the supercritical CO2 and advanced nuclear, we don't allow those technologies to be selected until 2040. So further out in time to account for those risks that I mentioned. One more thing that we factor in to account for those risks is at least for the supercritical CO2 and the advanced nuclear, we also limit how much can be selected in each year. So we limit those two technologies to 300 megawatts per year each. So they can both be selected up to 300 megawatts per year. And again, just trying to account for technology cost and performance risk for those. We want to have them in the plan to inform the plan, but we don't, because of the risk, we don't want them to dominate the plan and possibly cause us to make poor decisions. So the next thing I want to talk about, unless there's any questions on the commercial and pre-commercial technologies, is the Inflation Reduction Act. So this, I think everybody's familiar with it. This was put in or signed into law late last year. It did happen in a time frame that allowed us to incorporate, what we knew in that legislation or law into this planning process that informed the midpoint update. So it greatly expanded, increased tax credits, both investment tax credits and production tax credits for clean energy technologies. So we were able to incorporate that into the planning cycle and the expansion planning process. So I will say, at that time, there was, we were waiting. We knew that there was going to be more guidance, more clarification on everything that was in the IRA. One of the things was that we thought about carefully was, when should it expire? And the law said the later of 2032, or when the U.S. electric sector achieved 75% CO2 reduction of 2022 levels. That part was unclear. So what was more clear is 2032. So for purposes of this IRP, or this expansion planning process, we actually used 2032 as kind of the starting point for the phase out of the IRA tax credits. So that's how it was assumed here. That is something that we are reevaluating right now as we've learned more and got, there's more clarification out there, and we're also able to see what's a kind of a common practice in the industry. So we will possibly extend that phase out period in future IRP processes going forward. But for the purposes of this, what we did want to share with you is how we accounted for that in this IRP or this expansion plan. So for battery, well, there was multiple things. So there was several credits, and I forget all of the exact names, but we had some credits for meeting the prevailing wage and apprenticeship, energy community, and then domestic content. I think those were the appropriate names for each of the credits. So for some of these technologies, you could get up to like a 50% ITC in some cases. So for us, for battery, for example, for both just 2, 4, 6-hour battery and the medium duration storage, we assumed a 40% ITC for all selectable technologies that come in really by 2038. Beginning in 2039, they would no longer get that tax credit. Again, that's an assumption we made for this because of the phase-out period of the of the IRA. Then for solar, solar is getting a substantial production tax credit, at least for the first 10 years of a facility's in-service period. And same for wind. Wind also getting a substantial production tax credit for the first 10 years of its in-service period. So for those, substantial PTC. Then also the combined cycle with carbon capture and sequestration, getting the IRA's benefit of the first 12 years, getting an $85 per metric ton benefit for carbon captured and sequestered. So all in all, that's a lot. All in all, what we saw in these recent expansion plans is these tax credits are impactful. I mean, we were seeing a lot of renewables in the expansion plans before, clean energy resources in expansion plans before, but this is having the effect of increasing that and also moving the year in which some of these may be economic earlier in the planning horizon. And we'll show that a little bit later in the expansion plans.
So can you explain a little bit more on the solar and wind portions here where you're doing a 10-year production tax credit for COD before 2036 or 2039? In the model, are you saying then that if a solar facility is built in the model in 2036, that it would get 10 years worth of production tax credits after that?
Well, for solar, no. We're assuming that the IRA would phase out for solar beginning in 2036. But yes, if solar were to come in, solar is a little bit different. Let me hold off. Actually, the next slide is dedicated to solar. So let's do that one differently. For wind, if it's selected by the model prior to 2039, the costs that are input in this model are reduced because the first 10 years of that project would be getting these $20 plus production tax credits.
Yeah.
So beginning in 2039, it'd be a wind cost without the IRA.
Got it. Well, and so let me put it another way. So a wind project that gets installed or contracted with in 2038, you're
It
giving
would get
it
10 years from that period.
So
That's right.
it'd go out to 2048.
That's
then.
right.
Okay. And then can you give a little bit of commentary around choosing the production tax credit for solar versus using the investment tax credit for solar?
Yeah, save that for the next slide.
Okay.
So solar is a little bit different. This is what the IRA allowed for solar, but we still our solar cost assumption is informed by, as another benefit of the coordinated planning process, we have access to a lot of market data that offers, power purchase offers that have been made for each of our retail operating companies. So we start with that and then make adjustments to that, thinking, okay, how would the IRA impact that? Solar is a little bit different. This was what was in the IRA.
Yeah, got it. Okay, thanks.
No, great questions. So let's go there next. So this slide is also sort of busy, but there's some really good information here. And again, I'll give credit to this group here. Part of the feedback was, hey, how do your solar prices, assumptions compare to NREL? So we've paid a lot of attention to that over the last 3 years. And can continue to compare our prices to what NREL and other reputable sources show or project for solar cost information. So on this slide, we're showing in real levelized cost of energy terms in 2020 dollars, the 3 NREL projections. So NREL has a projection for advanced, for moderate, and for conservative, with advanced being the lowest, moderate being in the middle, and conservative being the highest. So you can see there's a wide range. And then we're including the assumption that Mississippi Power included in their midpoint update for a solar price without the IRA and a solar price with the IRA. So the larger dashed lines are NREL's projections. The smaller dashed lines are Mississippi's projections for with and without the IRA. And just stopping there, you can see that our Mississippi's projections are very much in line with NREL's lowest two, the advanced and the moderate, pretty much on top of each other. So this comparison makes us feel good about the reasonableness of the assumption that we're making. And then the solid black line actually shows what we actually assumed in the model. So for all solar that was allowed to be selected and was selected prior to 2036, it would be on the with IRA line. And then beginning in 2036, when we assumed the IRA would phase out, it would move up to the without IRA line. So moving really kind of from the advanced to the moderate lines, if you think about the NREL projections. Question?
I probably should have just kept it. Yeah, this is a really helpful slide. Thank you for including it. I would ask that you include a slide like this for the solar, or for wind and for batteries and some of the other technologies you're using, because this is exceptionally helpful, so I really appreciate that. I flipped through the slide deck here and didn't see another spot to ask this. So the previous speaker mentioned about the capacity valuations and the ELCC values regarding the renewable resources they're set at 0, is that right?
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, that came up earlier. So for solar, keep in mind, Brandon said this, that as the penetration level increases, we expect the capacity value to continue to decline. So in our system, again, looking at the entire pool, not just Mississippi Power, there's a substantial amount of solar that's already either existing, planned, or committed to, north of 10,000 megawatts. So then in the expansion planning process, with these cost assumptions, it's very economic to add even more, and tens of thousands more. So when we add that on top of what's already existing in the case, our assumption is that, okay, incremental solar on top of what's already in the plan will have 0 capacity value and be selected based off its energy value, which is, like I think Brandon said, 95+% of its overall value. So that's solar. But keep in mind, though, that that's just a planning assumption. If we go and conduct an RFP or do self-build and a specific solar project comes, it'll go through the valuation process that Brandon described, and it'll get an ELCC value that will now be used in the IRP process. But generically speaking, incremental is 0 capacity value. Wind, Brandon mentioned this, that we don't have a lot of data, but as a placeholder for now, we're actually using the 50% capacity value for wind. That may evolve as we get more information on onshore southeast wind, but for now, that is the ELCC we're assuming. And then for battery, he mentioned this as well. It has a substantial ELCC for several thousand megawatts of additions on the system. So we're accounting for that 90+% capacity value, or ELCC, for generic battery.
Okay, so the wind and the batteries get capacity credit, but solar doesn't.
That is correct.
Okay. Thanks.
Any other questions here, or if this is a good spot for questions that really hadn't been a good spot for them earlier? If none, I'll turn it back over to you, Charles.
Okay. Thank you, Randy. All right, does that do on the microphone? We good? All right, great. So I'm going to return to talking a little bit about the fourth part of the things that are uncertain going forward that we assemble into scenarios, and that fourth part is load growth. So let's see here. This is an opportunity to say a little bit about where load forecasting comes from. I am not load forecaster, but can say where it comes from. There are others if there are specific questions about that. But there is a robust process, and this process is done initially in the green boxes on this illustration. It is a Mississippi is a company specific process. So each of the operating companies has a load forecasting team that looks carefully at their region and their customers and potential load growth, and does a lot of projections, and in conversation with lots of parts of the business and economic development activities and personnel in the company, as well as external economic consultants and reports about economic growth in Mississippi, in the region. That's captured in the boxes on the left. What we do in addition to that in composing and that ends up being sort of a basic forecast about how load grows, load can grow in the region. What I'm going to talk about here is the four boxes, the four blue boxes on the right of the slide, which are, okay, we have one view, but that's not the only way in which load could evolve. There might be some other things. And so what additions might we make to that? And these things are done at an aggregate level. So the Mississippi Power load forecast in the green boxes is aggregated with the Alabama Power, is aggregated with the Georgia Power, and made into a system load forecast. And then we apply adjustments to that so that we have different views about how the entire system load might evolve that are then the basis for doing the IRP analyses. So the four adjustments, the four different views that we have of load are in the blue boxes on the right of the slide here. The first is we make no adjustments to the basic load forecast that is assembled from the operating company load forecasts. And then we make three different kinds of adjustments to it. One is an adjustment having to do with with natural gas price being high. So I mentioned that we do have a view about natural gas having a sustained high price. In that circumstance, we know that there are feedbacks between natural gas prices and electricity consumption, both because electricity, in many uses, in many end uses, electricity is a substitute for natural gas. Not immediately, but over time with sustained high gas prices, this can mean that electricity is, in many uses, the chosen resource rather than gas, and so electricity consumption can be a bit higher. And so that feedback is reflected in that adjustment. And so scenarios, you'll see in a moment, scenarios that have high natural gas prices will also have this load adjustment. The other two are labeled generically here, Alternative 1 and Alternative 2, and I'll talk a little bit about what they are. Alternative 1 is a view of load growth that we've constructed to be consistent with a moderate degree of greenhouse gas pressure. So how does greenhouse gas pressure affect load growth? There might be a couple of ways in which it might do that, and we've tried to capture both of them to a moderate degree in Alternative 1 and to a greater degree in Alternative 2. So one thing that you might think about for load growth being higher with greenhouse gas pressure is electrification. So of transportation or of other energy uses that might get electrified, that can tend to increase electricity consumption. Alternatively, greenhouse gas pressure can also be associated with sizable increases in end-use efficiency of electricity use. So end-use efficiency in lighting and in heat pumps and in other ways that are significant increases in end-use efficiency that might be associated with a general pressure on greenhouse gas emissions. So these two things together then, to a moderate degree, become our adjustment associated with Alternative 1, and in each of these cases, to a greater degree, more electrification or more end-use efficiency improvement compose what we mean by Alternative 2. Questions there? Okay, great. So this then, as I said, these are constructed and applied at the system level, but the question can be asked, well, okay, what about, what does that adjustment mean for the load forecast for Mississippi Power? And so that's what this slide illustrates, and I'm going to let Theron talk for a moment about it.
Okay, yeah, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the reference load forecast. We've kind of zoomed in on this just to show you the difference between the reference and Alt 1 and Alt 2. This is not a zero scale, so we're zooming in. But what's happening is we have a very large wholesale customer, Cooperative Energy, and our contract is scheduled to taper off over the next 13, 14 years. And at about, I think it's 2.5% per year. I think it amounts to about 20 megawatts per year that it's tapering off. And then at the end of 2035, that wholesale contract terminates. So that's a drop of about 350 megawatts. So that's what that big drop off is. So I just wanted to point that out about the reference forecast. And then, Charles, if you want to answer any questions about the Alt 1, Alt 2, and the reference plus high gas.
Happy to answer any questions if they are, but this is these are the differences in the different load forecasts illustrated for Mississippi Power. Okay. So the last slide for me then is the set of a table that summarizes the scenarios that were used to support the midpoint update. And so this is that table that talks about the 6 scenarios that we have supporting the midpoint update. And each of the rows in this table is one of the scenarios, and what it identifies is, well, okay, for scenario 1 or 2 or whichever, which greenhouse gas pressure view was adopted for that view, for that scenario, which view of technology cost and performance, which view of the way load might evolve, and which view of natural gas prices.
How do you want to advance this slide?
Oh, I didn't. Thank you. Sorry. This is where I intended you all to be looking. So that's what this table does, is to summarize then our scenarios, and makes the point that they are varying in these 4 areas that I talked about. The labels on the right-hand side in this table are important in that they're the labels that are used in the in various illustrations and discussions about the IRP analyses, and so they are shorthands that we use in lots of illustrations, and this is where they're defined. So I'm not going to talk through these. I'm happy to answer questions about any of them, but this is our summary of the 6 scenarios that we have adopted, and then these are the labels that will be used in the that are used in the IRP analyses in the various scenarios. So these are the 6 views about how things could evolve. And Simon, answer questions.
Yeah, so what about the Southeastern Energy Exchange market? Where does that piece of the puzzle kind of fit in with all the scenarios and everything else?
Well, say more about what you're thinking there.
Do you model the Southeastern Energy Exchange market?
It is not part of the scenario design. I mean, the exchanges that have to do with SEAM haven't changed the scenarios we model. That's what you're asking.
Well, so it's not modeled then.
Randy, yeah.
So for the SEAM, to shorten it there, it's an operational agreement where they're using transmission that's not been utilized. Existing transmission customer is not utilizing their transmission. They're using it on a 15-minute basis in operations. For the resource planning side or planning side, we still have to make sure, regardless of what's going on with SEAM, that we're bringing the adequate resources to serve our customers. Keep that in mind. I think what we have shared is that now that it's up and running, we will pay attention and focus on or look at how the SEAM is being utilized and look for if there's an opportunity to incorporate it in the planning process. But so far, we've not done that. And it just started, I think, last fall.
Yeah.
Went live last fall. So.
Okay. Well, and so I'm jumping ahead a little bit on kind of process for the integrated resource planning process here. For stakeholders, would you all consider adding additional scenarios if we can kind of describe them and provide feedback on what those scenarios might look like?
We really appreciate your feedback on that. I think last time, it was a Sierra Club suggestion on increased DER and increased electrification, I believe, is the other suggestion. So I think to the degree that you can be specific and maybe cite some sources that we can maybe both agree that, yeah, these are some good sources to use, like the NREL and some other things, we'll definitely take a look at those.
Okay. Good enough. Thanks.
Other comments or questions on scenario design? Okay, very well. We'll move on.
All right, an important part of our IRP process is assessing our capacity need. And so in our midpoint update, we did that. There it is. And so what I've got here, what I'm showing here is, I want you to first look at the red line. What we do is we take our load forecast and we add our target reserve margin to that. That's what Brandon was showing us earlier. We add our target reserve margin to our load forecast, so we have up there on the red line, load plus reserves. So that's the optimal capacity, or actually the minimum capacity we need to maintain in order to have a reliable system and to serve our customers. So what I've done is I've plotted the load plus reserves against our actual projected capacity. And what you can see on this graph is that the blue line, our actual capacity, goes below the red line, the load plus reserves, in 2031, and it creates a temporary need of about 400 megawatts for about 5 years. And of course, if you go back to the load forecast slide, what's happening there is when the cooperative energy wholesale contract terminates at the end of 2035, that 400 megawatt need goes away. And what's causing that need in the midpoint update and in the 2021 IRP, we made a planning assumption that Unit 5 at Plant Watson would retire at the end of 2030. That's a 500 megawatt gas steam unit. And so that's what's causing that 400 megawatt need to occur in 2031. One thing we did during the midpoint update, as part of the midpoint update, is we did a retirement optimization study for Unit 5 at Plant Watson. And we looked at, used our traditional unit retirement study approach, and we also used some other approaches using the Aurora capacity expansion model. And what that study indicated was that 2035 was the optimal retirement date from an economic standpoint for Unit 5. And that coincides with the termination of the cooperative energy contract. So when you do a sensitivity and you look at what that would look like with extending the operation of Watson 5 for 5 more years to the end of 2035, you can see that it fulfills our need pretty well. It looks basically the red line and the blue line are tracking one another very closely, so we no longer have that temporary need of 400 megawatts. And anything else on needs assessment? All right, Randy.
All right, we're getting close to the end here. So this is really the point where we've pretty much hit on all of the input preparation, input assumptions that go into the development of knowing when we have a capacity need, how much it is, and then and also helping inform the generic expansion planning process. This chart, again, just another visual, very busy, and we've pretty much covered this already, but this is just a very high-level overview of the green boxes show what all the inputs are that we've talked about today at great length, and then the red circle reflects kind of the tool, the method, the modeling of the generic expansion plan, and the blue represents the generic expansion plan by year for all of the scenarios that are part of the scenario design. So really what I want to go to now is show the results. So this slide shows the Mississippi cumulative expansion plan by the year 2032 for each of the scenarios. So just kind of orient you, there's a lot of information here. It's kind of the way these are organized is the first 3 are $0 carbon scenarios, but we do vary the fuel price, low, moderate to high. And then the 3 on the right-hand side introduce the price on carbon or the annual limit on carbon emissions, being the EL case. The other is what we've been talking about is the solid bars represent capacity, and then the patterned or hashed bars represent the energy portion of those resources. So that accounts for solar is energy only, so there's no solid green bar for solar. What you do see for wind, the purple technology, that it's 50/50. So that accounts for 50% capacity value, and the rest of that would be based off its energy value. And then you can't really see it for battery because the battery has such a high capacity value, but there's a small component of battery that doesn't have capacity value as well. So that kind of orients you to what's going on there with the bars. But really, one of the key takeaways here is, so the other thing I wanted to share, so this matches Theron's first capacity need slide. So this does assume that Watson 5 is, as a planning assumption, is retired by 2031. So that's why you see that there's a 400-ish megawatt capacity need by 2032. So one of the kind of general themes here is, as you can see, is one, solar is selected, and with the prices that we're assuming, given the IRA tax credits, it's an economic resource across all the scenarios. So that's one key takeaway. And then for others, as you introduce either a higher gas price or a price on carbon, we see other clean energy technologies like wind and CC with CCS enter the picture and become economic options in those futures. So we see wind selected in 3 scenarios, HG 0, 20, and 50. Again, solar across all, and battery is selected across the majority of the scenarios as well. So yeah, this is the generic expansion plan. I think it does provide a generic roadmap for where we think maybe economic options in the early 2030 timeframe should Mississippi have a capacity need. It can always evolve as things change, but across this range of futures, this does show generically what the economic optimal mix is to meet Mississippi's needs in that timeframe. Simon?
Yeah, thank you. You all provided the MG0 case in the mid-supply update, which was really helpful. Is there a way that you all could provide the other scenarios as well for the rest of the stakeholders?
I was thinking we did include the
Yeah, so in the mid-supply update, the only data that was provided was for the mid-gas zero price. You didn't include it for the low gas, the high gas, the $20, the $50. No, I'm talking about the, it was the supply side mix study results, I think.
Oh, was it in the actual midpoint document itself or a supporting work paper?
It was supporting work paper B, generic expansion plans.
Okay.
Yeah, you included it just for the MG0, but if you could include it for all the other ones, that would be great.
I think our intention was to include all of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that will be great. And then if you're able to provide it for the rest of the Southern Company fleet as well, because again, you're trying to dispatch against the rest of the subsidiaries, that would be helpful. But I did want to point out something that kind of looked a little unusual here, where you've got the low gas and the mid gas scenarios, those first two ones. My presumption in a low gas scenario, when gas prices are cheap, that you would want to add more gas units rather than less. But you've got kind of an opposite situation here where the model is selecting more batteries in the cheap gas scenario than in the slightly higher priced mid-gas scenario. So what do you think's going on there?
Yeah, we actually had the same question. And what we've seen, what's going on is pretty interesting, is in most cases, battery and wind are actually competing with each other. So it really, you don't see it in a cumulative plan, but if you look at the year-over-year, the full year-over-year plans, you can actually see it better, what's going on with both battery and wind. So what's happening in the lower gas price scenario, avoided costs are lower, So the wind's getting less energy value, so there's less wind being chosen, and it's advantaging the battery. So the interesting dynamics is really battery and wind that swap and not gas.
That's really interesting. Great, thanks.
You're welcome. Any other questions on this one? So the next one's going to look very similar, but it's by 2042. So it's a very similar story. By 2042, the need is much higher because as you saw on Theron's slide, that's into the time frame where we're making the planning assumption that Daniel 3 and 4 are retired. So the capacity is just much higher. But it's a very similar story. Solar looks economic across all the range of scenarios in this view as well. And we again, as gas prices are higher, or there's a price on carbon or a carbon pressure, we begin to see the clean energy technologies enter the mix. One thing I'll point out here is you do see there's a lot more gas that shows up in this scenario or this view by 2042. And that's largely due back to our assumption about the IRA expiring. When the IRA expires in the mid to late 30s, and then the capacity need really shows up in the 40s when it's those clean energy technologies are not getting that tax credit any longer, they're not as attractive. So it's actually selecting gas really to fill the Daniel 3 and 4 megawatts in that time frame. So what I would say is, back to what I said earlier, that's something we're reevaluating for when we will assume the IRA expires. And should we assume that it continues on beyond the 2040s in the next planning cycle, I would expect that mix to look different and probably have more clean energy resources that are taking advantage of those tax credits from the IRA. Any questions? I think that's the last slide for the generic expansion plans. And next up, are you doing this?
All right, last slide. In the 2021 IRP, we had 4 action items that came out of there that we were pursuing. That was the transition, or the things that we were doing. The transition of the fossil steam units, that path has not changed for us. Technology options, as we've discussed extensively here, yep, as well as Walnut Grove. Demand side management, we've talked about those changes as well that we've made in response to that action, or in line with that action plan. In transmission, we continue to enhance our reliability and resiliency of our system. The new volume just went up there. The new action items, and this is really, some of these are tangent, and I'll say that they don't appear in the discussion we've had today because some of these are also based on our EDP, which is our annual energy delivery plan. So that's why these appear like they're new topics. One is to reevaluate the solar subscription plan. Last year, we looked at a plan for all customer classes to have the ability to subscribe to a solar project. We went out for an RFP. As several of y'all may be aware, there's still lingering supply chain challenges within the solar industry. So even though the IRA that came out, that's great. It came out after we had an RFP. So we didn't get to capture those, but we captured the downside, which is the market participants recognizing their supply chain challenges. So we plan to reevaluate and go out for another RFP if conditions look favorable. As Theron mentioned, we performed the optimization around our Watson 5 unit, and in the next IRP, we plan to incorporate those results and move Watson 5 planning assumption around retirement dates to 2035. And then with the recently finalized net metering rule, we plan to incorporate the expected changes to our forecast, both from a resource and from a load perspective from that change. So we'll incorporate that next year. So with that, that's all the prepared slides that we have. Ben, do you want me to bring you the mic for that, or do you want to come up here?
don't know if you all have kind of like a timeline of when comments are due and when the IRP will be filed, or milestones during this proceeding. I recall last year, or, you know, the last time that we went through this, it was a little difficult to arrange the order that said, you know, 30 days after this and 45 days before that. And so if y'all could think about putting together just some milestone dates of when things are anticipated, that would be really helpful.
Okay, in the interim, though, to be clear, I believe it's 25 days, you know, from today, so that would be just the next milestone for comments on that. I believe at least the general timelines are included in the IRP rule.
All right, so we did get 3 questions that were emailed in, and I'm just going to read them verbatim so as to not mess them up. The first one was from Forrest Bradley Wright, and he started, are there any major differences in how the DSM market potential study for this IRP will be or has been conducted compared to the TPOT studies conducted by sister company Georgia Power? Is the DSM market potential study for this IRP cycle complete? Will it be made available to stakeholders, and if so, when? Will this cycle's IRP include year-by-year energy and capacity savings levels through the full IRP planning period? Will it include annual budget estimates for DSM program spending? By the way, thank you for adding manufactured home program to your portfolio. This is a good step in the right direction. The second email we received was from Chip Estes. First question, please explain what are the causes for the must-run designations as stated below by Bates White? And then he quoted the Bates White report, Section 7, Fleet Operations, Conclusion 7.3, the 4 units at Plant Daniel and 2 units at Plant Watson were designated as must-run during many hours and in every month of the audit period. The must-run designated resulted in the commitment and dispatch of Daniel 2, Watson 4, Watson 5, when incremental and average costs were greater than AIER, resulting in potential loss of to MPC of millions of dollars. And then number 2, please explain how and when will MPC comply with the recommendations from Bates White, and will the results be made public? The recommendation 2022-5 Bates White recommends that a study be done or commissioned by MPC to A, evaluate the must-run cost incurred by each OPCO in the pool, B, determine the reasons for the must-run designations, C, assess if must-run costs are evenly spread across pool members. Once the results of the study are known, compensation mechanisms, if warranted, should be considered. Question 3, are MPC/Southern Company pursuing carbon capture and storage activities, studies, etc., at Plant Ratcliffe? If so, please elaborate regarding these activities. Question 4, what are the heat rates for Watson 5, Daniel 1, Daniel 2, and Ratcliffe? Question 5, what are the continuing costs and activities, amounts, categories, etc., that MPC customers will be charged after MPC Daniel Coal Unit is shut down in 2027? Question 6, what are the costs and activities, amounts, categories, etc., that NextEra will be responsible for after the Daniel Coal Unit shuts down in 2024? Question 7, what are the projected capital expenditures expected in order for Watson 5 to operate until 2035? And then the last question, the third question from Mr. Wright, the follow-up. Since submitting my earlier questions, I now see that MPC filed a 2021 Mississippi Power Market Potential Study Report on February 15, 2023. Is this the study that will be used for DSM inputs in this IRP cycle, or will a new and/or updated market potential study be conducted? If the 2021 market potential study filed by MPC on February 15th is the DSM study that will be used in this IRP cycle, can you please provide, after the meeting, 20-year average TRC/PACT ratios, energy savings, dollar benefits and dollar cost figures for the maximum achievable potentials compared to the ones provided for the realistic achievable potential in tables 4-7 and 4-8 on page 37. Is there any avenue through which other information requests can be submitted following this meeting? And then Mr. Wright just sent another one. Let's see. In addition to whatever the efficiency savings levels are used in the company's reference case, will MPC analyze an energy resource portfolio with a higher level of MPC-funded energy efficiency program investment / savings reflected in the load forecast, without other variables that would obscure the direct effect of the higher MPC EE investment? Said another way, this would allow a direct comparison to be made between the company's reference case portfolio resource additions and the portfolio that emerges with higher MPC EE levels without other variables, using only the same assumptions as the reference case on greenhouse gas pressure, fuel cost, electrification, etc. That concludes the emails.
That's right. That's usually our typical process. This will give us a head start on evaluating those, but typically we look at whatever gets filed as well. And then that's used to formulate input into the IRP. Then we'll have the technical conference, and then there's comments after the IRP as well. And so through all that, and we have reply comments at that point in time, and that's where we typically have responded in the past to essentially all the list of various items that have been brought up in comments and otherwise. So what I propose we use the same process to address it, because we have in the past, much like the list that I presented today, are kind of addressing what was brought up in these various meetings and how we've responded to those. Are there any other questions? All right, hearing none, thank you very much for your participation today. We've enjoyed the experience, and I hope you all did too. We got a lot of good input today, so thank you all very much.